Welcome to the deep dive. You're here because, well, you want to get the important stuff quickly, and that's what we're aiming for.
Yep, cutting through the noise.
Today, we're really digging into a YouTube video by Sergei Kontsavoy. It's called Eme Arava Eswa.
Which translates to meditation of perfection versus the desire to suffer.
Right. Now, it is in Russian, but don't worry, we've waded through it for you. We're going to pull out Kontsavoy's main ideas about suffering, why we have it, maybe where it really comes from.
And his take on a way out based on quite a mix of sources.
Yeah, he draws on everything from the Old Testament, Hindu ideas, all the way to the Buddha.
And the big question he really throws out there, the thing we're sort of tackling as our mission today, is do we actually deep down want to suffer?
It's provocative, right? Okay, so let's unpack it. Kontsavoy kicks things off with an observation about his own video.
Yeah, he noticed that people he actually knew weren't really giving him feedback.
And his explanation, he calls it metaphysical intoxication. Bit of a mouthful.
Yeah. But he describes it as this kind of paralysis, you know? Like, even if you intellectually get that, you need to make some internal changes. And he stresses these are personal changes, things nobody else can block. You just feel stuck.
Yeah.
Unable to actually do it.
It's like knowing you need to eat better, but, well, you keep reaching for the junk food anyway, that kind of thing.
Exactly that feeling of being unable to act on what you know.
Which, I mean, that hits home, doesn't it? We all have those areas where we feel stuck, wanting things to be different, but finding it so hard to actually shift.
Okay.
So this deep dive, in a way, is trying to help cut through some of that, maybe, that overwhelm, that intoxication, and get some clarity on these pretty big ideas without, making your head spin.
Absolutely. And Kontsavoy offers a starting point, a first step maybe, to shake off that paralysis. He calls it the meditation of perfection.
Okay, meditation of perfection.
Yeah.
What does that actually involve?
Well, it's not about ignoring problems or pretending everything's rosy. It's more like a mental exercise, consciously aligning yourself with the idea that at its absolute core, the world is fundamentally perfect.
Even with all the messiness.
Yeah, even with all the obvious imperfections we see every day. He admits, it's not always an easy thing to grasp or accept.
No kidding. Turn on the news and perfect isn't exactly the first word that springs to mind for most people.
Right. But this is where he starts bringing in these religious and philosophical texts to kind of back up this idea of inherent perfection. He goes first to the Old Testament.
Genesis, right, the creation story.
Exactly. He focuses right on the beginning. After the Creator makes everything, the text says he looked at it all. And Kontsavoy really emphasizes that this includes the past and the future and declared it good.
Okay. So the starting point is goodness.
Yeah. Now, Kontsavoy does acknowledge what he sort of amusingly calls potential creator bias. Of course, the creator thinks their work is good.
Sure, makes sense.
But he sees it as laying down this fundamental baseline, that creation itself has an inherent goodness from the very start.
Okay, so it sets a foundation. Then he moves on to Hinduism.
He does, yeah. Specifically, the figure of Vishnu.
Vishnu, the preserver god in the Trinity, right? Brahma, the creator, Shiva, the destroyer, Vishnu, the preserver.
Exactly. And Kontsavoy points out something interesting. Vishnu, who he notes is a transcendent being, not part of Brahma's initial creation, actively enters the created world. Why? To support it, to preserve it. Vishnu's role is about upholding the Dharma, the cosmic order.
So the implication is?
Well, Kontsavoy interprets this as meaning the world must have inherent value, inherent goodness, this underlying perfection. Otherwise, why would this powerful being constantly intervene to keep it going? It's like a continuous validation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. A sort of divine vote of confidence in the world. Okay, and then Buddhism. The Buddha's silence after enlightenment. You said this part really got you thinking.
Yeah, it did. Because Kontsavoy offers a bit of an unconventional take here. He looks at the fact that after the Buddha became enlightened, he was initially silent, didn't immediately jump up to teach.
Right, there are stories about him hesitating.
Exactly. And Kontsavoy doesn't see this as, like, the Buddha thinking the world was too messed up or that he didn't care.
Okay, so what's his interpretation?
He sees it as a kind of nonverbal statement. Like, the Buddha had achieved this profound peace, realized the answers, and saw the inherent perfection of reality, of eternity.
So the silence wasn't indecision, it was contentment. Recognition of perfection.
Kind of, like he'd answered his own questions about suffering, understood its nature, and maybe saw the world as inherently complete in that enlightened state. So there wasn't this urgent need to fix or explain anything immediately.
Hmm. That's a different angle.
It is. Kosovo does mention the traditional stories where, a creator figure, maybe Brahma, maybe interpreted more metaphorically, eventually prompts the Buddha to teach out of compassion.
And then he taught for decades, right?
Absolutely. But Kosovo really zeroes in on that initial silence. He thinks it points to the Buddha's deep understanding of the world's inherent perfection.
Okay, so we have this idea of inherent perfection from Genesis, Vishnu, and the Buddha's silence. How does this connect back to suffering? This is where he brings in that really counterintuitive idea, isn't it?
Yes, this is the core of his argument, really.
Yep.
Most Buddhist thought, as people generally understand it, says suffering comes from craving, from unmet desires, right? You want something you don't have, or you cling to something impermanent, and boom, suffering.
Yeah, that's the usual explanation.
But Kosovo flips it. He suggests the root cause isn't just having desires, but having a fundamental, perhaps unconscious desire to suffer.
Whoa. Okay, a desire to suffer. That's a big claim.
It is a very significant departure. He observes, just based on his perception, that people almost seem born with an intention to suffer, as he puts it.
An intention to suffer. Wow. How does he support that idea?
Well, he brings up, almost as an aside, these legends or ideas about other worlds. He mentions the Orion constellation specifically, where suffering is supposedly really rare, like it's an exotic thing, not the default state. This challenges the idea that suffering is just, a universal, unavoidable part of being sentient.
So maybe our experience here isn't the only way things can be.
That seems to be his suggestion. He even pushes it a bit further, hinting that maybe some beings, somewhere along the line, actively contributed to suffering being so prevalent in our world.
Oh, okay, that's getting into some deep territory. He doesn't elaborate on who these beings might be.
No, not really. It's more of a suggestion that our suffering might not just be a natural byproduct, but perhaps something introduced or amplified. And this, for him, ties back to why we might have this underlying desire for it.
Right, it connects back. Now, he does acknowledge the standard view, too, doesn't he? That desires come from feeling like the world isn't perfect, that we feel a lack.
He does touch on that. And he makes a distinction, interestingly, between what he considers basic biological needs. He puts sex in this category, along with breathing and eating, just fundamental drives, and other desires.
Yeah.
Things related maybe more to creativity, self-expression, achieving things. But this desire to suffer he's focused on seems more fundamental, more primal than those specific wants. Almost subconscious, perhaps.
And this all loops back to the Buddha again.
Yes. Kontsevoy thinks that the Buddha's initial silence wasn't because he couldn't explain things, but because he saw this inherent perfection. And maybe he also saw this deep-seated human tendency, this desire towards suffering.
And this ties into the metaphysical intoxication again, how...
He argues that as we get older, this intoxication, this ingrained way of seeing the world, which might include that subconscious pull towards suffering, it just gets deeper, more set in its ways, harder to change.
Which makes sense. Habits, beliefs, they get pretty entrenched over time.
Exactly. And that's why he, Kontsevoy, feels he needs to speak out now, even though the Buddha was initially silent. He feels like people are, and this is his word, poisoned by this desire to suffer, operating with a skewed view of reality.
So he sees himself as trying to offer an antidote, maybe?
Kind of. He specifically pushes back against the idea that the Buddha didn't teach initially because people were just too stupid to get it.
Right, that would be a bit dismissive.
Yeah. Instead, Kontsevoy does this thought experiment. He tries to put himself in the Buddha's position. And he considers, what if the Buddha saw the perfection, saw people's desire to suffer, and just chose not to interfere initially?
Respecting their path, even if it involved suffering.
Perhaps. It raises really big questions about free will. When do you step in to help someone? And when do you let them follow their own course, even if it looks painful from the outside?
Definitely food for thought. So all this builds up to a pretty direct challenge from Kontsevoy to the listener, doesn't it?
Absolutely. He basically puts it right out there. Do you want to suffer or not? It's blunt. Yeah, no ambiguity there.
He says, look, if you do want to suffer, maybe subconsciously, maybe consciously, then, okay, maybe this stuff isn't for you. Fine.
But if the answer is no, if you genuinely want to move away from suffering,
then, he says, the path involves a kind of detoxification, not of the body, but of your metaphysical being, starting with the soul. with what he calls your subtle energy structures.
Subtle energy structures. What does he mean by that exactly? Is he talking about chakras, auras, that kind of thing?
He doesn't explicitly define it in detail in this clip, but it seems to refer to the non-physical aspects of ourselves, our ingrained thoughts, emotional patterns, deep-seated beliefs, maybe that energetic level that some spiritual traditions talk about.
Okay. And he mentions someone else's work here, Lazarev.
Yes, Sergei Lazarev, known for work on diagnosing karma. Consovoy brings him up in this context of understanding these subtle structures. Now, he makes a point of acknowledging Lazarev has some controversial political stances.
Right. It's important to separate the ideas from the person sometimes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Consovoy seems to be saying, look, whatever you think of Lazarev's later views, his earlier work on karma and these subtle energetic patterns, might offer some useful insights or a framework for understanding the kind of inner detox he's talking about. It's about looking at the potential value of the earlier concepts themselves.
Gotcha. So Consovoy sees his role then as sort of sounding the alarm alongside the Buddha in a way.
Pretty much. He's essentially saying, hey, wake up. You might be hooked on suffering without even realizing it, but there's another way to see and experience of the world if you're willing to do the work, starting with recognizing its potential perfection.
So let's try and really crystallize Consovoy's core argument for everyone listening.
Okay, fundamentally he's arguing that the main driver of our suffering isn't just bad luck, or external events, or even just wanting stuff we don't have. He suggests it might stem from a deeper, possibly innate desire for suffering itself. And he uses his interpretations of Genesis, Vishnu, the Buddha,
Right, all those sources.
to build a case that the world, underneath it all, is inherently perfect. And recognizing that perfection is the key, the first step, to potentially freeing yourself from that ingrained desire to suffer.
Which leads us to that final thought, that challenge for you, the listener. Really think about Consovoy's question in the context of your own life.
Yeah, how does your own relationship with suffering feel? Are you always actively trying to get away from it? Or could there be maybe some hidden part of you that's invested in it, in the drama, the struggle?
It's a tough question. Could shifting how you fundamentally perceive the world, seeing that underlying perfection Consovoy talks about, even when things look far from perfect, actually change your experience? Could that be a key?
It's definitely a radical proposition. Consovoy clearly thinks it's crucial, something to really mull over.
For sure. We really hope this deep dive has given you some solid food for thought. Maybe check out Consovoy's original video if you can, and keep exploring these ideas. Thanks for diving in with us.